The first recorded mention of him came not from a doctor's file, nor a hospital ledger, but from a trembling note scrawled by a landlady who claimed her tenant bled when he brushed against the corner of a wooden chair. His skin, she wrote, tore like tissue, as though it were nothing more than paper. She did not want the man's rent, nor his gratitude. She wanted him gone, fearing his affliction was contagious, or worse, cursed. By the autumn of 1924, in Seattle's damp streets, whispers about the paper skin man had already spread beyond the boarding house. Dr. Elias Corbin, a physician with a taste for peculiar cases, admitted later in his journals that curiosity overcame propriety. "I did not yet understand what compelled me," he reflected, "but when I first heard the description, I knew I would not rest until I had seen him myself." The man's true name, rarely spoken aloud, was Henry Loughton. He was 34, unmarried, and said to have once worked in the lumber mills along the Washington coast. Yet no one could confirm his employment records, and those who claimed to remember him contradicted one another. Some said he was cheerful, others that he never spoke. One neighbor recalled his hands wrapped in rags long before the landlady's note was written. Corbin described his first sighting with a peculiar detachment. Loughton's posture was crooked, shoulders drawn inward as though shielding himself from invisible blows. His face, pale and fine-featured, bore a quality of erosion. The physician observed cracks across his cheeks, delicate fissures like those of a dry riverbed. He wondered if the man had some wasting disease of the skin, but even in dim light the illusion was uncanny. The hook, for those who watched him in silence, came when he stumbled against the doorframe. The skin of his forearm split open, not in the bloody burst of a wound, but in a silent tear, like parchment ripped down the middle. No cry escaped his lips. He merely pressed the edges together with trembling hands, and for a moment it seemed the cut might fuse again. But the mark remained. Midway through Corbin's early notes lies a confession. The event struck him not only with horror, but with awe. What I witnessed defied the principles of anatomy. His tissue lacked the elasticity of living flesh. It appeared brittle, more akin to the pulp of pressed fibers than to human dermis. Yet he lived, and that fact alone unsettled me. Neighbors claimed Loughton avoided daylight, not because of shame, but because sunlight seemed to make him weaker, his condition worse. Children followed him at a distance, throwing pebbles to test whether his body would tear anew. The landlady insisted she once heard him crying in his room, the sound papery and thin, as though his very lungs struggled to hold together. By the end of that first week of observation, Corbin could not decide if Loughton was a medical marvel or a walking omen, but his instincts, sharpened by years of examining liars and malingerers, told him something essential was concealed. He knew more of his own affliction than he ever confessed. His eyes betrayed calculation, not ignorance. Seattle in 1924 was a city building upward, steel frames rising, industries booming, but beneath its growth lay shadows. And in those shadows moved men like Henry Loughton. Dr. Corbin sensed that the man's body was not merely frail, but emblematic of a deeper fracture, one not bound to skin alone. It was on the seventh day after dusk had fallen that the physician swore he saw something impossible, a figure standing in the alleyway, its silhouette sharp against the lamplight. He was certain it was Loughton, though the man had just moments before been confined inside his room. Corbin blinked, stepped closer, but when he reached the alley, it was empty. But the last words of his journal entry from that night remain the most chilling. I was no longer certain I was watching him. Perhaps it was he who was watching me. Dr. Elias Corbin would return to this line again and again, as though its weight unsettled him more than the tearing of Henry Loughton's fragile skin. That sense of being observed, scrutinized by the very subject he had sworn to study, marked the beginning of a darker suspicion. Corbin was a man of science, yet even he admitted that rational thought faltered under the glow of certain encounters. The following morning, he attempted a structured examination, inviting Loughton into his small rented study near Yesler Way. The man arrived wrapped in layers of gauze and cloth, moving with the stiffness of a doll handled too often. Corbin noted the careful way he lowered himself into the chair, as though sudden movement might shatter him entirely. When asked about the previous night, Loughton said nothing at first, only watched the doctor with eyes too steady, too penetrating. Then softly he whispered, "You see me everywhere, don't you?" Corbin's pulse quickened. How could Loughton know what he had written in his private journal? He dismissed the question with professional composure, but in his mind a new possibility began to form, that the man's awareness stretched beyond ordinary senses. Midway through the examination came another revelation. Corbin, attempting to inspect the fissures along Loughton's neck, saw the skin flake away beneath the lamplight. Not blood, but thin curls of tissue drifted down like scraps of paper. Yet beneath them there was no exposed muscle, no ordinary wound. Instead, a pale second layer gleamed, smoother than the first, almost manufactured in appearance. It was, Corbin wrote, as if he possessed pages within pages, each more unnatural than the last. The physician pressed for history. Had this condition plagued him since childhood? Was it hereditary? But Loughton's answers were evasive, and when pressed further, he grew restless. He spoke not of illness, but of memory. "There are lives I recall," he murmured, "lives not my own. They press against me from inside, begging to be let out." Here, Corbin's medical reasoning buckled. Dermatology could not explain remembered lives. Psychology, perhaps, but even that stretched the limits. Was this man delusional, or was there a connection between his brittle skin and his fractured sense of identity? The thought unsettled him, that each layer shedding away might conceal not merely flesh, but the imprint of another existence. Neighbors added fuel to the unease. A butcher on Main Street claimed Loughton stood outside his shop for nearly an hour, unmoving, long after Corbin swore he had seen him return to his boarding room. A child reported hearing him mutter names in languages she did not understand, and the landlady, whose fear grew daily, insisted she woke one night to find scraps of paper littering the hallway floor, curling and yellowed as if pages had been torn from a book. Corbin began to sense that the city itself was turning its eyes toward the paper-skin man. Rumors thickened, whispers swelled. People feared him, yet they watched for him, unable to resist the pull of the uncanny. For the physician, however, fear gave way to obsession. He wrote, "There is an order beneath his disorder, a pattern I cannot yet decipher. If his body is a book, then I must read it before others burn it." The tension rose to a breaking point one evening when Corbin found his study door ajar. On his desk lay a scrap, brittle and curled, on which was scrawled in hurried graphite, "You should stop writing about me." His hand trembled as he held it. The handwriting, he swore, was his own. That night, the physician did not sleep. He replayed each encounter, each whisper, each glance. Had Henry Loughton truly stood before him, or was he unraveling threads that no man was meant to pull? For the last line of that night's entry carried a warning he dared not ignore. If his skin is paper, then perhaps it is not only he who is being read, but me as well. Dr. Elias Corbin wrote those words with the unease of a man realizing he had crossed a boundary that reason could no longer police. He had begun with clinical interest, a detached desire to categorize Henry Loughton's strange affliction. But as the nights stretched longer, he sensed the relationship was reversing. He was not the observer, he was the observed. And worse, he feared he was being rewritten. The third week of their association revealed new anomalies. A clerk at the city archives reported seeing Loughton browsing through stacks of records, his bandaged hands moving delicately over documents as if afraid they would tear under his touch. Yet when Corbin confronted him, Loughton insisted he had not left his room for 2 days. The physician double-checked with the landlady, who swore she had carried food to his door at the exact hours the clerk claimed he was wandering the archives. 2 men, the same man in 2 places, an impossibility. Yet doubt gnawed at Corbin's rational mind. He began to wonder whether the paper-thin fragments of Loughton's body, those fragile scraps, carried more than skin. Could they carry presence, memory, or even mobility? The hook came during one of Corbin's late-night reviews of his journal. He noticed words on the page that he did not recall writing, phrases written in his own handwriting but strung together in ways he never used. "The boy in the mill," one entry read. "The fire in the valley. She is waiting where I cannot go." Each phrase hung like a thread leading to nowhere, yet Corbin felt certain they were not his own thoughts. They felt imposed, grafted onto the page like a parasite attaching itself to flesh. And then the mid-turn. Loughton confessed something. In a rare moment of lucidity, his voice hoarse, he said, "Each layer that falls is a page someone else once lived. I remember their names. I remember what they wanted, but they are not mine. They never were." Corbin recorded the moment carefully, yet privately admitted his horror. He wrote, "What if this man is not a patient but a volume, a walking tome bound in human likeness, with histories folded into him like pressed leaves? And what if each page shed is not loss but release?" Seattle's streets began to whisper of accidents. A dock worker fell to his death after claiming a pale man shadowed him home. A seamstress was found muttering about books breathing at night. In each report, Corbin saw echoes of Loughton, though the man swore he had been confined to his room. The physician's notes grew fevered, his margins filled with questions, sketches of layers, and one repeated phrase: "Who is turning the pages?" One evening, Corbin dared to test his theory. He collected a scrap that had fallen from Loughton's hand, a brittle, curling piece like parchment. Under lamplight, he held it close, and though the surface appeared blank, he swore faint impressions emerged, letters as if etched in fading ink. He traced them with his finger, and a memory not his own washed over him. The sound of axes in a forest, the scream of timber splitting, and the crushing silence after a tree had fallen on a man whose name he suddenly knew: Thomas Blake. He dropped the scrap, his heart racing. If this was true, if each fragment contained lives, then Henry Loughton was not only a man, he was an archive of souls. That night, when Corbin returned to his study, another scrap awaited him on his desk. No one had entered the locked room. On it was written in crisp, deliberate lines, "You are in the book now, too." And though he tried to dismiss it as his own delirium, the truth pressed itself into his chest like a knife. Perhaps I was not writing his story. Perhaps he was writing mine. Dr. Elias Corbin could not shake the sensation that the line had been forced through his hand, as though another intelligence had used him as its instrument. He reviewed his journals by lamplight, page after page, and felt a sick recognition creeping into his bones. Whole paragraphs bore words he would never choose, phrasings alien to his disciplined style. It was as if the very act of watching Henry Loughton had made his own thoughts porous, paper-thin, susceptible to inscription. The city, too, was changing. Rumors spread that scraps of parchment drifted through the alleyways, caught in the damp wind off Elliott Bay. Some swore the fragments carried words that vanished upon closer inspection. Dock workers muttered that their dreams had grown crowded with foreign lives, faces never seen by daylight. The more Corbin listened, the more he realized these disturbances traced back to one man, the fragile tenant with the brittle skin. The hook came when Corbin attempted to burn one of the fragments he had stolen from Loughton's room. The scrap curled quickly in the flame, yet instead of disappearing, it released a sound, faint, like a man exhaling after a long silence. The doctor recoiled, swearing that the sigh did not belong to him, but to some other presence, freed in the fire. Determined to uncover the truth, Corbin pressed Loughton during their next meeting. The man's eyes gleamed with a detached calm. "You think me ill," he said softly, "but illness does not write through you. They write, the ones before, the ones trapped. Each time a page falls, a voice stirs. Some follow the wind, some cling to the living." The mid-turn came when Loughton revealed he remembered a childhood that was not his own. "I was a sailor once," he murmured, "on a ship that never returned to port. I drowned in waters off the Aleutians, and yet I stand before you now. Tell me, doctor, how can I drown and breathe in the same lifetime?" Corbin felt his pulse surge with dread. Was the man confessing delusion, or had his condition torn the veil between lives? He noted how Loughton's speech carried conviction, not hysteria. If this was fantasy, it was woven with dangerous precision. More disturbing still, Corbin noticed deliberate cruelty in the man's behavior. He tested those around him, seeking their reactions like a child prodding at insects. One evening, the physician observed him standing outside the boarding house as a neighbor's dog barked frantically at his presence. Loughton tilted his head, almost amused, as if recording the animal's terror for some hidden ledger. Corbin wrote, "It is no longer innocence, no mere suffering. There is a will beneath the fragility, something cold, deliberate, and testing." That realization marked the breaking point. Until then, Corbin had pitied Loughton as a victim of strange biology or curse. But now he recognized calculation. The man knew his effect, knew the spreading fear, and seemed to nurture it with quiet satisfaction. The physician's professional detachment began to erode. Each encounter felt less like an examination and more like a duel, two minds circling in the shadows of the same room. Corbin's clinical notes shifted in tone, sentences laced with suspicion. "If he is a book," he wrote, "then he is not passive parchment. He is author and archivist both. The question is not what is written in him, but what he intends to write into us." Late that night, Corbin heard footsteps outside his study door. When he opened it, the hallway was empty, save for another scrap on the floor. This one bore a single word, etched deep into its fibers: "Observe." The doctor trembled as he realized what it meant. He was no longer the sole watcher, he had become the subject, and so he confessed in his last line that night, heavy with dread. Perhaps Henry Loughton had never been the victim at all, but the experimenter. Those words haunted Dr. Elias Corbin long after he set them down. The possibility inverted every assumption he had carried since first laying eyes on the man. If Loughton was not a sufferer, but instead a conductor of suffering, then all the sympathy that had drawn Corbin close was nothing more than bait. He found himself replaying each encounter, dissecting not the man's condition, but his intention. How many silences had been purposeful? How many wounds inflicted for demonstration rather than accident? Seattle's neighborhoods began to feel like an organism infected by a slow, deliberate poison. Corbin collected whispers the way others collected specimens. A midwife claimed her sleep was broken by dreams of paper rustling in her ears, as though unseen hands turned through her body like a book. A young boy was discovered tracing lines across his own skin with a penknife, whispering that he was trying to read what was written underneath. Corbin noted the spreading contagion of imagery. These were not isolated delusions. They were echoes radiating from a single source. The hook came when Corbin examined reports of other unusual deaths in King County over the last decade. To his astonishment, patterns emerged. 3 men crushed under falling timber, two women drowned in shallow water, a farmer who swore before dying that his life was not his own. Each account bore uncanny resemblance to the memories Loughton had described: the sailor drowning, the boy in the mill, the fire in the valley. Corbin scribbled in the margins of his notes, "Are these fragments his to recall because they once belonged to the dead? Or does he plant these deaths in us like seeds?" The mid-turn struck during an interview with a gravedigger. The man told Corbin that once, while digging on the edge of the city, he unearthed a thin, papery sheath beneath the soil. At first he thought it cloth, but when it clung to his hands, he realized it was skin. Fragile, translucent, flaking like parchment left too long in the rain. He buried it quickly, never speaking of it until Corbin pressed him. The physician's blood chilled. If true, then Henry had shed more than anyone knew, leaving layers buried beneath the city like secret manuscripts. The doctor's analytical mind fought to frame it as metaphor, but the deeper he looked, the more deliberate it all seemed. This was not a man helplessly disintegrating. It was a man methodically leaving records, spreading himself across space and memory. A patient might shed skin without control. An experimenter would ensure each scrap found its way into eager or fearful hands. By the fifth week, Corbin realized he was not alone in his surveillance. He noticed strangers trailing him, their eyes fixed too long upon him, their manner oddly stilted. One man in particular, gaunt and pale, stood outside his study for 3 consecutive nights, silent and unmoving. When Corbin finally confronted him, the figure only smiled, then pressed something into his palm before disappearing into the fog. It was another scrap with words in ink that looked disturbingly like Corbin's own. "We are reading you now." His hands shook as he considered the meaning. If the city itself was infected with these fragments, if the people were beginning to behave as carriers of Loughton's design, then the doctor was not merely documenting a case. He was caught inside a growing manuscript, his life absorbed into an expanding archive that no fire or grave could contain. That night, sleepless and trembling, he scrawled his most dire observation yet. "The city has become his library, and I, unwilling, am both page and reader." Dr. Elias Corbin carried that thought like a fever in his blood. Everywhere he turned, the signs multiplied. Newspapers carried strange errors, half-finished sentences, misplaced words that seemed eerily familiar to the fragments he had seen fall from Loughton's body. A sermon given at the First Presbyterian Church included, without explanation, a phrase from Corbin's own notes. "Who is turning the pages?" He had never spoken those words aloud. The doctor's professional resolve began to blur into obsession. He resolved to confront Loughton directly, to strip away the evasions and hear his truth without disguise. But when the moment came, it was Loughton who asked the questions. "You've been testing me, haven't you?" Loughton's voice was calm, almost gentle. His eyes lingered on Corbin's desk where journals lay stacked, leaving details wrong, a date misplaced, a name inverted. "You wanted to see if I would correct them. That is what you were doing." Corbin froze. He had indeed planted false entries in his notes, hoping to measure whether Loughton's uncanny recollections were mere coincidence. Yet he had told no one. The man's awareness, his precise knowledge of the doctor's methods, chilled him. The hook struck hard. Loughton not only knew, but he recited the errors back word for word, smiling faintly as though savoring the physician's discomfort. "You wrote that the mill accident killed Thomas Baker," he whispered, "but it was Blake. I knew the boy's name before you tested me. The mistake was yours, not mine." In that instant, Corbin realized the experiment had reversed. It was he who had been measured, his reactions studied, his confidence dismantled piece by piece. Midway through their tense exchange, Loughton leaned forward and asked a question so pointed it seemed rehearsed. "Doctor, how many lives do you think are folded into your own?" Corbin attempted to dismiss the inquiry as delusion, yet the man's steady gaze forced him into silence. He felt exposed, as if layers of his own past were being peeled back. He wondered in some quiet chamber of his mind if he too was a page within a larger book waiting to be read aloud. From that day forward, Corbin no longer doubted Loughton's intelligence. This was no passive sufferer of disease. This was an archivist in flesh, a careful keeper of details who corrected history itself with unnerving precision. The city began to respond to him in strange ways. A bookseller told Corbin of a pale man who entered his shop, touched a single volume, and left. Hours later, the bookseller discovered entire pages missing, not torn, but vanished as if they had never been printed. A woman in Georgetown swore her family Bible rearranged itself overnight, passages rewritten in handwriting that mimicked her own. Corbin could not escape the feeling that all of it, the city's errors, the rewriting of texts, the spreading scraps, was not random but orchestrated. A pattern existed, one beyond the reach of ordinary science. Loughton was the axis, but Corbin himself was being drawn into the mechanism, like an unwilling assistant in a laboratory of memory. Late one night, returning to his quarters, Corbin found another scrap waiting on his pillow. Unlike the others, this one was smooth, untouched by decay. Across it, written in his own familiar script, were the words, "You cannot close a book that is still being written." His breath caught as he realized the implication. This was not documentation of the past. This was an ongoing authorship, one in which his own life, his own thoughts, were being drafted without consent. In the margin of his journal that night, his hand trembling, he wrote the only conclusion that seemed possible. "I am no longer merely recording him, he is recording me." That realization infected every hour of Dr. Elias Corbin's days. He began to dread the act of writing, fearing that every stroke of his pen carried not his own intention but Loughton's. Yet to stop writing felt even more dangerous. What if silence meant surrender, an empty page waiting for someone else's hand? The physician grew cautious, locking his journals, hiding them in drawers, but the words always found him again. Sentences appeared on scraps left beneath his door, under his pillow, even once tucked into the pocket of a coat he had not worn in weeks. The handwriting was indistinguishable from his own. Sometimes reading them, Corbin could not remember whether he had written them or not. The hook arrived one rain-slick evening when Corbin, driven by desperation, followed Loughton beyond the boarding house. The man moved with eerie precision through the streets, as though retracing a route etched long ago. Corbin trailed him through alleys until they reached a derelict print shop near the waterfront, its windows boarded, its door chained but not locked. Inside, the smell of ink lingered beneath the dust. Piles of discarded type and broken presses filled the gloom. But what stopped Corbin cold was the discovery in the back room. Hundreds of scraps pinned neatly across the walls, layered like wallpaper. Each bore fragments of sentences, names, dates, entire passages. He stepped closer, his breath caught, and realized with horror that many were copied from his own journals. It was not a collection, it was an archive, a hidden library where Loughton preserved his unfolding manuscript. Midway through his inspection, Corbin noticed something worse. Some scraps were not his words. They were strangers' words, written in different hands, spanning decades. Letters from dead men, diary entries from unknown women, prayers scrawled by children, all pressed together in one expanding web, as if the city's memories had been peeled from their keepers and fastened here. The physician nearly fled, but a movement at the far end of the room froze him. Loughton stood there silently, his head tilted, eyes gleaming in the dim light. His skin, flaking at the edges, shed tiny curls that floated downward. He raised a hand, not in threat but in invitation. "This is where they are kept," Loughton whispered. "Pages cannot stay bound forever. They must be copied, preserved. Otherwise, who will remember?" Corbin, trembling, demanded to know whose memories these were. The man's answer came like a blade slipped between ribs. "They belong to those who are gone, and those who will be gone soon. You too, doctor, have left me many pages already." The physician staggered back, his chest tight. Loughton did not advance, yet the sense of control was absolute. Corbin realized then that the man had lured him here deliberately, to witness the full extent of his design. And then came the revelation that twisted everything further. Among the pinned scraps, Corbin found not only words, but diagrams, anatomical sketches, methodical notes, records of each encounter. They were not the scribbles of a victim. They were the plans of a careful experimenter, tracing the shift from individual memory to communal infection. Each stage, each subject, documented with precision. Corbin's voice cracked as he asked, "Why me? Why my words?" Loughton's response was quiet, almost kind. "Because you understand enough to fear, but not enough to stop me. That makes you the perfect witness." The doctor fled the print shop, but he carried with him a truth that now burned against his mind like acid. I had not discovered his archive. I had only stumbled into a chapter already waiting for me. The words weighed on Dr. Elias Corbin like a verdict. He no longer believed himself to be an impartial witness. Instead, he felt ensnared in a design that preceded his involvement, a story that had anticipated his curiosity and woven him into its fabric long before he ever set foot in that derelict print shop. By the next morning, Corbin attempted to bring his findings before colleagues at the University of Washington. He spoke cautiously, omitting names, framing the phenomenon as a hypothetical disorder of memory and skin. Yet their response was dismissive. One professor chuckled, remarking that Corbin's obsession with folklore had finally overwhelmed his clinical rigor. Another suggested he take a leave of absence for his own health. The hook came when one of the younger physicians pulled him aside afterward. The man's face was pale, his eyes haunted. He whispered, "I've seen him too. I dreamed his face before you even spoke. But if you continue this, they won't only dismiss you, they'll destroy you." Corbin recognized the truth. Authority would not act, not because they lacked evidence, but because the evidence itself threatened the stability of their reason. To admit Henry Loughton's existence as more than a patient meant admitting the porousness of reality itself. Institutions thrived on boundaries. Loughton's very nature was the erosion of them. That night, Corbin confronted him directly in the boarding house. "Why me?" he demanded. "Why do you leave your scraps for me alone?" Loughton's reply unsettled him more than any threat could have. "Because you write them better than I do," he said softly, almost with admiration. "Your hand is steady. Your fear makes the words sharp. A good archivist must care for the script." The mid-turn deepened when Loughton leaned closer, his skin crackling faintly like dry parchment. "Tell me, doctor, when you dream, do you not see them now? The drowned sailor, the boy in the mill, the seamstress whispering over her needle. You carry their weight already. You are not outside this book. You are one of its pages." Corbin recoiled, yet the truth gnawed at him. His dreams had grown thick with foreign lives, vivid and detailed beyond mere imagination. He awoke with aches, with knowledge he should not possess, with names he had never learned but could now recite flawlessly. If these were only dreams, they were stitched into his waking bones. The barrier between them sharpened in that moment. Corbin knew he should denounce Loughton, alert the authorities, sever all ties. Yet the man's calm gaze carried a challenge. To do so would be to admit his own contamination. Already, his colleagues whispered of his instability. Already, the scraps had appeared in his own coat pocket, in his own handwriting. It became a game of psychological endurance. Loughton never raised his voice, never threatened outright. Instead, he asked questions that sliced deeper than any blade. "When you forget something, Doctor, where do you think it goes? Perhaps it doesn't vanish, perhaps it waits, pressed between the layers of someone like me, waiting for another chance to be read." Corbin left the boarding house that night, shaken to his marrow. He realized Loughton no longer needed to spread fear through strangers. He had already bound the doctor himself as his most vital subject. At his desk, in the cold light of early dawn, Corbin's pen moved almost of its own accord. His final words for that entry bled into the page. "He has made me his witness, but worse than that, he has made me his accomplice." Dr. Elias Corbin wrote the words with a hand unsteady from sleepless nights, his pen dragging like a reluctant blade. To be a witness was tolerable. A man of science bore witness to many strange afflictions. But to be made an accomplice suggested action, collusion, a hidden complicity that stretched beyond observation. The thought clung to him like the damp fog that swirled in Seattle's streets. The first sign that his private terror was spilling into the open came through a friend, Charles Whitman, a fellow physician and one of the few who had not yet dismissed him. Whitman arrived one evening, pale and tight-lipped, confessing that his young daughter had begun muttering strange phrases in her sleep, words that matched nearly verbatim the entries Corbin had shared, only with himself. "How would she know?" Whitman demanded. "She speaks of sailors drowning, of pages falling. My daughter has never seen the sea." Corbin's stomach knotted. He had not told Whitman of Loughton, not directly, yet somehow the infection of words was spreading to those closest to him. The hook landed days later when Corbin returned to his study to find not a scrap, but an entire page neatly placed atop his journal. It was written in his own hand, but the words described a crime not yet committed: the poisoning of Charles Whitman. The page ended with a line that froze his blood. He must be silenced before he spreads doubt. Panic seized him. Was this Loughton's design or some deranged fragment of his own subconscious? Corbin burned the page, though he could not erase the certainty that its very existence foretold a choice. The mid-turn arrived in a confrontation. Corbin demanded of Loughton, "What have you done? Why are they speaking my words?" The man's expression was serene, almost fatherly. "Because, Doctor, your words are theirs now. You record, you preserve, and preservation is power. It is not enough for one man to carry the archive. Others must hold fragments too. Your friend's daughter is only the beginning." Corbin's fury broke into trembling fear. Loughton spoke not as a patient, not as a man cornered, but as an architect calmly describing a structure already raised. He saw no malice in his words, only inevitability. That, Corbin realized, was the greater horror. Loughton did not see himself as dangerous but necessary, a vessel for continuity, however cruel. Yet Corbin also began to sense his own life narrowing, pressed into margins by Loughton's hand. He feared not only for himself, but for those within his circle. If the infection of memory spread to Whitman's child, how long before it reached others? His neighbors, his colleagues, his own family. It was then he resolved to resist, not merely to observe, not merely to write, but to act. He began drafting a plan, though every step felt like a battle against his own hands. He would need allies, someone beyond the reach of Loughton's quiet influence. Perhaps even Whitman himself, though the risk was unbearable. The question that gnawed at him was simple but devastating. Was resistance even possible? If words themselves were the instrument, then even the language of defiance might already belong to Loughton. Still, Corbin pressed his pen to the page, inscribing his determination like a vow. If I cannot sever him from the city, then I must sever him from those I love. Better to bear this sickness myself than let it hollow them all. That vow, however, carried its own dreadful weight. For in the silence of his study, another page appeared as if conjured from the air, bearing a message that made his blood run cold. You have already chosen. Your circle will be mine. And so the final line of that entry read, trembling but unbroken, he has set his eyes upon those dearest to me, and the game has turned from observation to survival. The sentence burned itself into Dr. Elias Corbin's mind as though branded there. It was no longer an intellectual puzzle, no longer the detached fascination of a physician examining a singular case. Now it was a hunt, and his family, his friends, his dwindling circle of trust stood in the crosshairs of a man who seemed less flesh than manuscript. Corbin's first instinct was to guard his wife and his 2 young sons, though he hesitated to expose them to the truth. How could he explain that a man whose skin peeled like paper threatened them more than any knife or pistol? Still, he caught himself watching them at breakfast, wondering if stray words would escape their lips, phrases that did not belong to them, but to him, or worse, to Loughton. The hook came when Charles Whitman returned with a confession of his own. He had begun to keep a record of his daughter's strange utterances. In one dream, she described standing in a mill, hearing the shriek of saws. In another, she whispered of drowning in black waters, begging unseen hands to pull her ashore. Whitman begged Corbin for a cure. The doctor, hollow-eyed, could offer none. It is not infection in the body, he admitted, but in the memory itself. Midway through that week, Corbin forced himself into methodical clarity, as though donning the armor of science might protect him. He charted the incidents on paper, noting times, locations, recurring themes. He traced Loughton's movements, cross-referenced the scraps, cataloged the echoes in the dreams of others. His conclusion chilled him. Each case was not random, but progressive. Small demonstrations had grown into larger infiltrations. The arc resembled the deliberate stages of an experiment. Stage 1, fragments shed, discovered by accident. Stage 2, memories transferred into strangers. Stage 3, entire circles of acquaintances drawn into the fabric. Stage 4, Corbin dared not write the 4th. Yet even in his analytical notes, he admitted something darker. He does not test at random. He chooses. Each subject is bound to me as though I were the spine that holds this volume together. One evening, desperate for clarity, Corbin cornered Loughton near the waterfront. Rain fell in sheets, plastering the man's clothes to his fragile frame, yet his eyes burned with unsettling vitality. "Why them?" Corbin shouted over the storm. "Why my friends, my family?" Loughton's reply came steady, unbroken by the weather. "Because every archive requires a key, and you are mine. Without your fear, without your witness, the pages scatter. You bind them, Doctor. You keep them alive." The mid-turn struck like lightning. Corbin realized he had not simply been documenting an affliction, he had been sustaining it. His notes, his careful preservation of each detail, had become the glue holding Loughton's impossible archive together. The physician had not merely been trapped, he had been weaponized. That night, unable to sleep, Corbin recorded his most terrifying admission yet. He described earlier incidents in a tone stripped of metaphor. The sailor who drowned, the boy in the mill, the seamstress with needle-pricked fingers. All of them, he now believed, had been test subjects, not accidents of disease, but deliberate orchestrations preserved through scraps, through memory, through him. The conclusion spread across the page in shaking ink. I have become the custodian of his crimes. And as he wrote it, another page slid from between the folds of his journal, one he had never placed there. On it, written in his own hand, were words that made him drop the lamp in horror. Your sons will remember me next. The final line of his entry carried the weight of a man both broken and sharpening toward defiance. I must act now before the next page is torn from me and placed in them. Dr. Elias Corbin repeated those words in his mind like a vow, though he could not be certain whether the vow was truly his own. His sons slept soundly in their beds, yet he imagined their lips moving in whispers, syllables borrowed from the scraps that had haunted him for weeks. He lingered in their doorway long into the night, uncertain if he was guarding them or saying farewell. The first step of action demanded distance. Corbin resolved to send his family away, cloaking the urgency in excuses of health. "The damp here is too much," he told his wife, forcing calm into his voice. "Take the boys to your sister in Portland. I will follow when my practice allows." But the words tasted false, and in his notes he admitted the truth. He was not saving them from illness, but from a contagion that traveled by memory. The hook appeared the following day, when Corbin received a message folded into his medical texts. No one had entered his study. The page had been waiting for him. It bore only a single phrase: "You think to send them away? Books travel farther than bodies." His hand shook as he held it. Loughton knew. He always knew. Corbin's desperation curdled into resolve. If he could not protect his circle by distance, then he must sever the source. He drafted a plan with meticulous care, not as a healer, but as a man preparing for confrontation. He traced Loughton's routes, noted his hours, the places where scraps accumulated most frequently, the boarding house, the abandoned print shop, the waterfront shadows. The mid-turn came when Corbin realized his surveillance was not one-sided. Returning late one evening, he found his study window open, though he had locked it. On his desk, his own journal lay splayed, the ink still damp, though he had not touched it. Across the margins, in unfamiliar but steady hand, was a note: "Your methods are thorough. You will make an excellent subject." The implications struck him like a hammer. Loughton was no longer content to bleed into strangers, no longer satisfied with fragments scattered into the city. He had fixed his attention fully upon Corbin, not as witness, not as accomplice, but as the next experiment. The physician wrote with grim clarity that night, "I have no illusions now. I am the page he most wishes to turn." Yet with clarity came a sliver of courage. He could not abandon his oath as a doctor, but neither could he deny the reality before him. If he must become subject, he would enter the role on his own terms. He began carrying a small scalpel in his coat, its edge sharpened not for healing but for defense. He also enlisted Whitman, who, though skeptical, saw the terror etched in Corbin's face. Together they whispered of plans: how to lure Loughton into isolation, how to gather scraps as evidence, how to present undeniable proof. Yet even Whitman trembled at the suggestion. "If what you say is true," he warned, "then we are not capturing a man. We are capturing a book that refuses to be closed." Corbin did not argue. He only wrote in his final entry that night, his words heavy as iron: "The experiment has chosen me, but before he can turn this page, I intend to tear it from his hands." Dr. Elias Corbin's vow hardened into action. He and Charles Whitman met in secret, whispering like conspirators, though they had once spoken as colleagues. They mapped the plan with a surgeon's precision. Lure Loughton to a place of confinement, force him into exposure before witnesses, and end the endless ambiguity that shielded him. It was not justice they sought, nor even medicine. It was containment. The hook came one damp March evening when Corbin returned to the print shop, hoping to gather further evidence. He brought Whitman with him, though the man trembled visibly. The shop reeked of mold and ink, its walls still plastered with scraps. But the arrangement had changed. Where once the pieces had been scattered, now they formed deliberate shapes, rows like shelves, an imitation of an ordered library. At the center stood a single empty space on the wall, wide enough for a man. Whitman whispered in horror, "It's waiting. For you." They left quickly, but Corbin knew the trap had already been set. He was meant to step into that space, to become another page in the archive. The confrontation arrived sooner than expected. Loughton appeared outside Corbin's study 2 nights later, as if summoned by the very act of resistance. His presence filled the hallway not with noise, but with unbearable silence. Skin flaked from him like drifting ash, catching the lamplight. He spoke in a voice that was both weary and commanding. "You cannot bind me, Doctor. I am already bound to you." Corbin drew the scalpel he had hidden in his coat. His hand shook, yet he did not falter. "This ends tonight," he said, though the words felt feeble against the weight of the man before him. The mid-turn erupted when Loughton smiled, unafraid, and extended his arms. "Then cut," he said, "but remember, what you sever is not mine alone. Others live in me. Do you wish their blood on your hands?" The question struck like a hammer. Corbin's oath as a physician roared against his desperation. To harm Loughton might mean to release or destroy the lives he carried within, those voices embedded in the scraps. Yet to spare him was to doom his family, his city, perhaps the world. Whitman, who had followed, lunged in panic. He grabbed at Loughton's fragile arm, but the man moved with uncanny speed. The struggle was sudden, chaotic, the crash of furniture, the hiss of torn skin. For a moment, Corbin believed they might overpower him, but Loughton's calm never broke. He fought not with rage, but with inevitability, as though the outcome had already been written. At last, Whitman managed to pin him against the wall, while Corbin pressed the scalpel to the man's throat. For a heartbeat, victory seemed possible. Yet even then, Loughton whispered, "Every page you write tonight will belong to me, even this." The doctor's resolve trembled. His hand hovered, caught between salvation and damnation. And in that pause, Loughton wrenched free, leaving a flurry of scraps drifting through the air like snow. Some stuck to Corbin's skin, clinging as though magnetized. He tore them off, but each bore words he had never written, memories that did not belong to him. The struggle ended not in triumph, but in a terrible stalemate. Loughton, though restrained for the moment, still radiated control. Corbin realized the man could not be defeated by blades or bonds. The battle was deeper, etched into the fabric of memory itself. That night, with Whitman shaken and silent, Corbin wrote his conclusion with grim finality. "We trapped him, yes, but in binding him, I felt the binding tighten around me. The experiment has not ended. It has only shifted its stage." Dr. Elias Corbin clung to that thought in the days following the confrontation. Henry Loughton had been removed from the boarding house under the guise of medical transfer. The city believed him taken to an institution outside Seattle, a facility better suited to house fragile men whose minds and bodies had collapsed. But Corbin knew better. He had been present when the orderlies dragged Loughton away, his eyes glimmering like embers that would never burn out. The paper-skinned man had not been defeated. He had simply been given a new stage, a new audience. The hook came almost immediately. Within 48 hours of confinement, a nurse reported that one of her colleagues had collapsed after claiming he heard whispers written across the walls. Another swore that scraps of parchment had appeared inside his uniform pocket, though he had never entered Loughton's cell. By the third day, orderlies refused to patrol the night shifts alone. Corbin was summoned to observe, as though his prior knowledge made him indispensable. He stepped into the asylum and found its atmosphere charged with unease. Patients muttered in unison, repeating fragments of phrases he had once written in his journals. The boy in the mill, the drowned sailor. Who is turning the pages? Their voices carried not the tone of madness, but of recitation, as though reading from a text they all held in common. Loughton sat at the center of it all, bound to his chair, his skin flaking steadily onto the stone floor. He looked more corpse than man, yet his voice remained steady. "They think they watch me," he told Corbin in a low, even tone. "But you know the truth. I watch them. I write them. The bindings only tighten the words." The mid-turn struck when Corbin gained access to Loughton's journal, discovered hidden beneath his bedding. The book was unlike any medical file. Its pages were coded, written in strange symbols and patterns, but when Corbin traced them, he realized they were not symbols at all. They were layers of handwriting superimposed, dozens of different hands pressed one atop the other, as though 100 people had written their memories into the same surface. He recoiled, yet fascination dragged him deeper. Among the scrawls, he found fragments unmistakably his own. Lines copied word for word from his private journals, entries no one else had ever seen. The asylum staff had not provided Loughton with pen or ink. The words had manifested nonetheless. Corbin began to understand that confinement was no safeguard. If anything, it concentrated the contagion. The patients in neighboring cells twitched in their sleep, their bodies shedding flakes of skin that looked suspiciously like brittle paper. One nurse whispered that she had awoken with letters imprinted faintly on her arms, as though pressed there during the night. Corbin recorded in his notes with growing dread. The institution believes it holds him. In truth, he holds them. He tests them as he tested me. His bindings are the bindings of a book's spine, meant only to keep the pages together, not to prevent their reading. Late one evening, as Corbin turned to leave the ward, he caught Loughton's gaze. The man smiled faintly and mouthed a phrase without sound. Corbin did not need to hear it aloud. He recognized the words as his own, taken from an entry he had burned weeks earlier. The next chapter belongs to him, and so the doctor closed his journal with a hand that trembled, the final line of his entry etched with despair. "The asylum is not his prison. It is his library, and I am still being written." Dr. Elias Corbin replayed that realization as he walked the halls of the institution, the smell of carbolic and mildew thick in the air. Each step echoed with the muttering of patients, their voices fractured, weaving together into a chorus of words that once belonged to him. It was as if every wall had become a page, every room another chapter in a book that refused to end. The hook arrived when an orderly rushed to him, pale with panic. A patient restrained for weeks had somehow unbuckled his own straps and attempted to swallow torn fragments of parchment. When they pried open his mouth, the scraps were gone, dissolved into nothing. "He said it was food," the orderly stammered. "He said it was memory." Corbin felt his stomach twist. This was no accident. It was Loughton's design, expanding beyond his own skin. What had once been confined to fragments now spread through others, consumed, absorbed, embodied. In his clinical notes, Corbin tried to maintain detachment. He cataloged the phenomena: sudden synchronization of speech among unrelated patients, the appearance of faint script across arms and legs, the inexplicable vanishing of medical records replaced with blank sheets. Yet the more he wrote, the more he doubted whose voice filled the lines. He recognized phrases he would never choose, as though the journal was no longer his but dictated through him. The mid-turn struck when he discovered Loughton's cell late one evening. The bindings that held him remained intact, yet the man sat upright, smiling faintly, a book open across his knees. Corbin's heart froze. The institution had not given him any book. He stepped closer and realized the pages bore no printed ink, only fresh handwriting scrawled in dozens of styles. One entry he recognized instantly. It was his own, written that very morning, though the journal never left his pocket. "You see," Loughton said softly without looking up, "books write themselves if the hand resists. Every refusal, every denial, still it ends upon the page. You can't stop it. Corbin's voice cracked. What do you want? Loughton looked up then, and his eyes glowed with a calm that chilled the physician more than any threat. Not want, doctor, need. The archive must grow, the pages must continue. Without me, memory fades. Without me, you vanish. Corbin left the cell shaking. He knew the staff believed Loughton fragile, restrained, powerless. But in truth, the man's influence had never been stronger. The institution itself had become a hive of voices, each patient a vessel for new fragments. Nurses spoke in whispers not their own. Orderlies stared at their hands as if seeing words etched upon their skin. And then came the discovery that shattered what little hope remained. In a locked drawer of the superintendent's office, Corbin found a journal not unlike his own, coded, layered, filled with fragments that bore the superintendent's handwriting. The contagion had already reached the staff. Authority had been compromised. That night, as he struggled to sleep in the physician's quarters, Corbin awoke to the sound of faint scratching. He lit his lamp and froze. On the wall above his bed, letters were forming, etched by no visible hand. They spelled out a sentence that turned his blood to ice. You will dream the next chapter tonight. Corbin wrote his final entry of that day with trembling fingers, every word heavy with dread. Even here, under lock and key, he writes us all. The asylum has become his press, the staff his typeset, the patients his paper. The next chapter waits not in him, but in me. Dr. Elias Corbin carried that truth like a sickness in his blood. He no longer believed Henry Loughton to be the sole author of their strange manuscript. Instead, he feared that the man had merely been the first page, an introduction. The true volume was still unfolding, and Corbin now felt the ink drying in his veins. The hook came one night when Corbin awoke not in his quarters but standing in the asylum corridor, his journal open in his hands. He had no memory of rising from bed, yet the ink was still wet on the page. He had written words he could not recall. The doors will open tonight. He will not be alone when he leaves. And so it happened. Amid a storm that rattled the iron gates, the asylum fell into chaos. Locks clicked open without keys. Patients wandered the halls whispering in unison, their voices weaving fragments of stories that belonged to no single mouth. Nurses collapsed in exhaustion, their lips blue from chanting lines in languages they had never learned. And in the midst of it, Henry Loughton walked calmly through the corridors, his bindings discarded, his fragile skin flaking but never failing him. Corbin and Whitman attempted to stop him, but their strength meant nothing. Scraps of parchment swirled like snow, clinging to their coats, their faces, their hands. Each one bore words that seemed pulled from their own minds. This is not escape, Loughton told them softly. It is continuation. The mid-turn arrived when Corbin realized he had written the entire event, hours before it unfolded. His own journal described the storm, the chaos, even Loughton's words. He had not witnessed the future, he had produced it. The paper-skinned man no longer needed to write. Corbin was writing for him. In the confusion, Loughton disappeared into the storm. His body was never found. Some said he dissolved into the wind, leaving only a flurry of scraps behind. Others swore they saw him walking the waterfront, his steps steady, his skin unbroken, but Corbin could never confirm what was true. What he did know was worse. After the storm, the city itself seemed altered. Newspapers printed stories that no one remembered reporting. Children spoke of lives they had not lived. Men and women dreamed of drowning, of fires, of mills, of books without covers. Each fragment echoed the archive, as though the experiment had expanded into the very streets. Corbin resigned his post soon after. His notes had become unbearable to read. Every page carried not his thoughts, but an echo, a shadow, a directive from something larger. He burned dozens, but fire never felt final. The words lived on in memory, in whispers, in dreams. His last journal entry remains the most haunting. He did not escape the asylum. He escaped into us. If his skin was paper, then our minds are the ink and our lives the bindings. The book will never close because the book is all of us. And so the macabre case of the paper skin man never ended with Henry Loughton's disappearance. Some believe he was only a man with a disease, a tragic figure misunderstood. Others, like Dr. Corbin, insisted he was something else entirely, an experimenter who proved that memory itself could be contagious. Perhaps what lingers is not the man, but the method. Perhaps we are all already turning his pages without knowing it. What do you believe? Was Henry Loughton victim or architect, patient or author? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories like this, because some truths are not written to comfort us. Some truths are written to be carried, whether we want them or not.